So hello everyone, welcome to the Dialectics of the Case 1. My name is Vanessa Grossman and I am an assistant professor at Delft University of Technology. It is a great pleasure to moderate the first session of Critic All after such a great keynote speech. I thank the organizers for this honorable invitation and I thank you all for being here on their behalf. I'm also happy to see many familiar faces and name tags on Zoom from different corners of the world, but also new ones that I'll have the opportunity to meet today. I'll try to be fast because we have a long day of presentations, and I'll proceed by quickly introducing the speakers before each of the presentations. I also urge them to stick to the 15-minute time so that we have enough time for discussion after the 4 presentations. The conference's organizers will help me keep track of the time, and they will send the speakers a message 5 minutes prior to the end of their time slot. So our first speaker today is Katelijne Nuisink, and my apologies for my Dutch, which is not there yet, who is a lecturer and a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture at ETH Zurich, and Katelijne is a colleague, as I was myself a postdoctoral research fellow at ETH till last year. She obtained master's degrees in architecture from TU Delft and the University of Tokyo, before earning a PhD in East Asian languages and civilizations from the University of Pennsylvania. Her current research focuses on cross-cultural knowledge exchange in architectural culture and aims to contribute to a more dynamic and inclusive history of architecture. Today's paper is a product of her Marie Slodowska-Curie postdoctoral research project that explores the potential of contact zones as a general historiographic method in the field of architecture. So Katelijne, you may now share your screen with us to present this programming, planless, non-movement, no style, dialectic strategies in the Shinken-shinku residential design competition, 1965-2019.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, and the whole Critical team for being able to present one of the effects in the Shinken-shinku residential design competition, which was the topic of my postdoctoral research. So in 1965, the editors of the Japanese architectural journal Shinken-shinku launched an international housing idea competition to rejuvenate its long-running magazine. Exciting design proposals from young architects responding to renowned architects serving as single judges were to attract a new and younger readership. The Shinken-shinku residential design competition, as it was named, was bilingual from the beginning, which was to serve a double function. On the one hand, the competition would help propagate Japanese architecture culture, as Japanese architects at the forefront of architectural production were, in their role as judges, able to promote their ideas by freely setting competition themes. This effect was amplified when the competition materials reached a foreign audience through publication in the English language magazine, The Japan Architect. On the other hand, the competition helped to activate the local Japanese housing debate with fresh ideas from abroad. So well-known foreign architects such as Peter Cook, serving as judges, incited the Japanese debate with provocative competition themes. And of course, the multicultural responses from participants around the world, published in the Japanese language magazine, Shinken-shinku. This paper explores the intricate logic behind the Shinken-shinku design competition in order to illustrate how the dialectic strategies proposed by the jurors have successfully resulted in solutions not contained in either program or this program, simplicity or complexity, plan or planless, style or no style. It takes as a tangible case study the 1996 edition of this competition, in which Judge Kazuyo Seijima set yet another dialectical theme, namely that of the possibilities of non-movement. Observing the increasing domination by speed and new media, Seijima confronted contestants with the static aspects of architecture. Instead of considering this immobility as a limitation, non-movement served Sejima well to think anew about movement, a strategy with which he challenged other architects to widen the possibilities of architecture. When Sejima in 1996 was invited to serve as the judge, she had already made a name for herself by winning prestigious prizes in Japan. Her work had also entered foreign media, of which a special issue of El Croquis on her build work in Japan played an important role in spreading her fame outside Japan. Aware of the highly globalized environment in a new digital age, Sejima introduced her competition brief as follows. Today, our lives are becoming freer from physical restrictions, as well as time constraints, through the various networks brought about by new media. We can see that everything has become informationalized. Speed has become increasingly faster, and various forms of interchange have become possible. However, architecture does not move. While architect's static aspect at first sight might be seen as a hindrance to this movement, Sejima simultaneously recognized opportunities for design in the tension between architect's static aspect and a rapidly changing society. As such, she formulated her competition brief in such a way that it redirected contestants into going beyond a mere solution that reflects either movement or non-movement. She continued her brief by putting the static in opposition to the dynamic. And I quote, rather than being a restriction, can this non-moving aspect not be thought of as actually widening the possibilities of architecture? Is it not possible to give birth to a stationary architecture that relies on this environment brought about by the various media, instead of one that ignores this environment? After encountering the 439 competition entries, Sejima selected 12 winning schemes, one first prize, 6 other prizes, and 5 honorable mentions. The selection of multiple winners is emblematic of this competition, demonstrating that the competition was set up from the start as a platform of discussion rather than the search for a single right answer. In her judge comments, Sejima elucidated 3 general approaches to the subject matter. The first approach came from contestants who established a dialogue between things that move and things that don't move. A second approach was embedded in the proposals that layered the virtual space of media and computer cyberspace over non-moving constructions, and with that, contrasting things that move with things that don't move. A third approach was rooted in proposals that introduced a non-concrete system, such as a media network, to suggest an urban lifestyle, a house diagram, or the like. Yet looking at the 12 winning schemes, Sejima also admitted that actually, quote, none of them fit neatly into any of these classifications, end quote. Sejima's call led Croatian architectural duo Vinko Penezic and Krešimir Rohina to take up the theme of nature. In nature, Rohina explains, everything is on the move, but still appears as a very stable and infinite system, end quote. Inspired by sameness and planarity, embedded in traditional Japanese patterns that Rohina encountered firsthand in Japan, he came to the insight that architecture is in fact a form of nature. For the competition, he and his partner started to draw spirals as a planar pulsation that ended up as a geometric structure fractured into 1,000 pieces. At first sight, it is not clear whether the model submitted for competition depicts an entire city or merely a single house. The planar surface of the model oscillates up and down, while the cuts and cracks in the surface are a substitute for traditional building elements such as columns and slabs. Digital processes are like natural processes and evolve exponentially rather than mechanically, explains Rohina. Their architecture of emergence and disappearance follow exactly these natural processes. For Sejima, this entry illustrated an attempt to recreate through architecture both the static quality of nature as well as the constantly changing diversity within. Instead of juxtaposing architecture and media, Panasic and Rohina juxtaposed architecture with nature. With that, they added the idea of technological disappearance to a discourse in an age when technologies were considered as something that should be visible. The resulting dynamism within the scheme delighted Sejima. Jürgen Meyer didn't participate in the competition to design for the topic, but he felt already had a good response at hand with his thesis project from Princeton University. Taking the ephemeral qualities of Sejima's own work as a clue for a person who would be able to understand his project and a disability be able to respond to his entry, Meyer submitted a project that dealt with climate and weather conditions. Everything that is usually considered a failure in a building, think of leakage, interior heat, extension and contraction of building materials, turns into something positive in Meyer's proposal. Water drops from a leaking roof help fill the bathtub underneath. Condensation on a wall is used as a means to create privacy with less transparent walls. Friction on the floor will make the house warmer, while moving down into the house will get you in a colder area. As such, Meyer's entry is about exploring the tension between non-movement and movement through the idea that the house is a space that binds you to a place, while the conditions around you make your imagination move. With digital technologies, an increasing amount of diverse information is available to us without moving from our seat. How will these new technologies influence the materiality and the perception of architecture? Jean-Philippe Lanois responded to this question with a pavilion for architectural exhibitions that had an interactive service. Equipped with LCD screens, the images of the exhibition reflect on the skin of the rectangular glass box, making the content of the exhibition the container of the exhibition as much as the container becomes the content of the exhibition. As such, Lanois provided the director of this exhibition space with the power to change the architecture of the building. The selection of information on display determines the image of the building. The building, therefore, is not merely a container of information, but one that can turn information into architectural material. Viewed on an urban scale, the static building becomes alive. Inside, the building allows you to connect to any other global network of buildings dedicated to architecture, thus making the material of the building one that has simultaneously movement, provides information, and is connected to places elsewhere. Pornchain Bunsom and Jarod Broussard submitted a scheme that starts off with the idea that nothing in motion can be understood without static reference points. They illustrated their idea not with a single house design, but rather with a city map that explores the tension between movement and non-movement. In the first panel, the buildings in black represent static reference points, while the wide open spaces signify fields of dynamic systems. In the second panel on the right, they reverse the colors to highlight the tension between the open spaces in motion and their respective static borders. With the now black areas defined as being in motion, the now white areas are conceptualized as the channeling forces that contain and define motion. Boonsom explains, quote, since movement and non-movement are interdependent, exploring the possibilities of non-movement was simultaneously to explore the possibilities of movement. I noticed that it was applicable to both nature and man-made environments, which led me to develop my city layout, end quote. Now, what struck Sejima as particularly stimulating about this submission was that it contained an abstract quality of thinking in the formalization of the distinction between non-movement and movement. Emerging technologies were also key to the proposal of Shahed Salim and Stephen White. Inspired by his time during transit, Salim realized that nothing in airports has any kind of fixedness to it. Rather, everything is continuously moving. The architecture of airport terminals gives an illusion of stability, but is in reality just a fluid space where people pass through, Salim explains. In response to this non-fixedness, Salim and White proposed an alternative transit lounge, one with an X-shaped structure that is detached from the actual ground. Upon arriving at their point of transit, airplane travelers do not arrive in an airport terminal, but step into these kind of transit lounges and are then immediately brought to the next airplane. A series of these X-shaped lounges floating in any environment result in a transit landscape in which there are no recognizable reference point to nation or nationality. Sejima ultimately awarded first prize to a collaborative submission by the artist Richard Scott, architect Kirsten Whittle, and philosopher Jeremy Weed for a proposal that relies on the concept of when everything moves at the same speed, movement is rendered invisible. The contestant used new computer technologies to be able to change reality and create an actual environment from it. The resulting entry, called Soft Space, is a series of time-lapse photographs with multiple exposures of Richard Scott drinking tea. In the conversion from regular to time-lapse photographs, the contestants tried to find a way to specialize the flow of the movement and thus actualize their theory. The resulting image displays a face space, an environment that responds immediately to its users. What struck Sejima about this project was that it was not simply describes the effects and characteristics of the space resulting from a dialogue between movement and non-movement. No, the strength of this project lies in its ability to forward the conditions for the realization of a diagram of the dialectic between non-movement and movement. To conclude, the 1996 competition edition, The Possibilities of Non-Movement, judged by Kazuyo Sejima, instigated a lively discussion about the opposition between movement and non-movement. The diversity of responses to the competition illustrate how much discussion on architecture was affected by new digital media in different modalities and appearances, and how far one could go using technologies that were not at their disposal even yesterday. While the world was getting excited about the new possibilities generated by movement in the mid-1990s, Sejima challenged contestants with a rather poetic statement about architecture, its static nature, and its problematic relationship to the modern context generated by new media. What seemed like a very mundane question at first, architecture is static, turned into the moderation or under the moderation of Sejima into a question on substance and form. As such, Sejima's call was a tasteful introduction into space making and the performance of space, one not based on program and the dynamic force of how a building can operate in terms of a problematic layout. Despite the awareness of the new possibilities that digital media could offer, Sejima was not looking for digital architecture per se. Yet, her introduction of the dialectic in the competition served her well for two reasons. By contrasting the new media conditions with the age-old static condition of architecture, Sejima pushed the contestants in a certain direction that will result in much more interesting solutions than merely asking for an exploration of non-movement or movement. Secondly, it helped her to further position herself as an architect who not simply rides the waves of the curvilinearity discourse at that time, but instead carefully considers the reciprocity between what stands still and what moves in the design of new environments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katelaine, for sticking to the 15-minute slot. Our next speaker is Guillermo Lockhart Milan. Guillermo is an architect who holds a diploma from ORT University, Uruguay. He holds a master's degree in advanced architectural design with a specialty in housing from Universidad Politécnica de Madrid. Currently, he is a PhD candidate at the same university focusing on architecture for creative work, particularly related to domesticity and art. Within the teaching field, he was a professor at ORT University and assistant at Iñaki Abalos unit in the Master of Architecture at Politécnica de Madrid. For the past 3 years, he has been working as an independent architect between Madrid, Guadalajara, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Lima. Please share your screen with us, Guillermo, to present Post-Studio Architecture, Buren versus Warhol.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, Jaime, Mariana, and the rest of the critical team. My name is Guillermo Lockhart. I'm a PhD student from Universidad Politécnica de Madrid. And my thesis supervisor is Sergio Martín Blas. And the title of the article I'm presenting is called Post-Studio Architecture, Buren versus Warhol. This presentation will discuss that there's a false dichotomy between two models of art studios that oppose the private and the public, doing and thinking, hiding and revealing. These two models are supposedly represented by the workspaces of Daniel Buren and Andy Warhol, but it will be demonstrated that there's a permanent interaction, superposition, and dialectic between both of them, which enables an alternative architectural understanding of their conception. Oh, sorry. Sorry. The artist studio is historically venerated as a venue for personal creativity, but was harshly critiqued during the 1960s when artists started exploring different modes of production and exhibition due to conceptual art, minimalism, land art, pop, and performance. So the studio represented a type of practice which some artists wish to replace or avoid altogether: isolated genius, manual labor, and restrictive, romantic, and masculine context. The French artist Daniel Buren in 1971 wrote this article called The Function of the Studio, where he defined the studio in terms of frames, envelopes, and limits. Buren developed his argument comparing the Parisian studios of the 19th century with the North American loft of the 1950s onward, saying that both types should be left behind completely. He also ended his article stating that his work proceeded from the extinction of the studio, implying change in the relationship between this architectural space and his creative process. Then Buren workspace would be open, mobile, and extended in the city. It would be in situ. So as the studio's death was officially declared, the birth of the post-studio era was being announced. However, the link between the artist and the creative space is not as clear and absolute as it seems to be implicit in the overly broad term post-studio. On the one hand, Andy Warhol had a complex relationship with his workspace, with the Silver Factory, and his aesthetics and urban links. And on the other hand, Buren did not take such a radical distance from the studio as he is wont to claim. Buren workspace in the city and Warhol's Manhattan studio were reconstructed through a series of drawings that permitted the analysis of the spatial qualities and architectural design. These original drawings were made through an exhaustive examination of photographs, films, and documentation. Buren words in his text in the function of the studio seem consistent with his own artistic practice. In 1968, Buren created the series consisting of the partial covering of 200 billboards in Paris with an expressive formal pattern of vertical stripes and without any legal authorization or invitation from any gallery or institution. The photograph footage shows that he leaves this enigmatic gesture that appropriates the space for thousands of people that would be passing by. So art was presented as an advertisement, mimicking its position, its size, and its condition. And also Buren work intended to compete with a network of urban signs that we can find in Paris, in the street of Paris, when the scenery was the site of a political struggle during May of 1968. Buren provoked a reflection from the contemplation of the background, the architecture, and the city surrounding. His work implied a movement from the canvas to the wall. Other architectural features such as doors or windows would follow, and from painting to space, and from studio to the city. In 1964, Andy Warhol rented a place that was used by a former hat factory. The loft presented a flexible, adaptable interior architecture and minimal facilities. Its open floor plan allowed a constant redesign and simultaneous activities such as band rehearsing, slam poetry, silk screening canvases, rock rehearsals, recordings, and so on. In this sense, this space represented the negation of the specific and technified square meter of modern architecture, and at the same time, the evaluation of cubic meters without any specific qualities of any kind. And when we look at the interior of this space and the photographs that were taken, disorienting effect catches us. It is pretty difficult to detect the point from which these photographs were taken. So there's a deliberate attempt to create an artificial isotropy by the silver painting and paper used in all the interior of the space, and to be used as a new spatial component for creative work. One of the main points of putting power relations in crisis lies in altering the social and practical functions of the object's symbolic values. So a couch in the middle of an industrial warehouse, of course, would reformulate the concepts of comfort, privacy, or intimacy. In the silver factory, objects from different environments, often and mostly contradictory, composed a chaotic landscape that combined the popular and the distinguished, the functional and the useless, the just and the exaggerated, and the new and the obsolete. Contrary to what is generally believed, the Solar Factory was for Warhol a vacuum that left him alone to work, and at the same time, a place where friends would come over and do the work for him. So each project, as we can see on screen, paintings, sculptures, films, photographs, and literature, music, and so on, would have been impossible without him, while paradoxically, each creation highlighting the creative process as an essentially social experience. Warhol took over the city and lived in its center, and the character of his studio was anti-marginal, but at the same time, nobody occupied a specific space. Nobody had a reserved seat. There were no established schedules, and the rotation of people of different backgrounds, education, professions meant a representation of the city itself inside a studio. So art was understood as part of the everyday life, now linked not only to an architectural site, but also to a specific urban territory. So by analyzing both situations, we can see that the artists have engaged different strategies for showing certain aspects of their practice. For example, the change of role, the artist change of role, while carefully hiding others, like the perpetration of authorial work. Buren works on site, no longer required a studio, so he got rid of his former one, and since then he had been occupying an office, which can be seen in one of the photographs in this photo souvenirs collection, just as any other low to middle rank manager in a corporation. And at the same time, Warhol became a visual supervisor, an image controller, an artistic production manager, but not an assembly line worker. Although Buren recognized the influence, impact, and meaning of the context on the work of art, his own is still paradoxically the result of authorial action. The studio's supposed disappearance in his work was the new starting point and could be considered as one of the most essential aspects of Buren practice, but at the same time, uh, one of his fragile points. Uh, its extinctions, its extinction becomes incarnation. He is his studio. For Warhol, the Silver Factory was an unstable and evolving context and the medium for his art. It was not a frame, and certainly it was not a restrictive context. It was an active art form. The design strategies used by Warhol, such as the search for artificial isotropy, indeterminacy, and decontextualization of objects and also people, allow truly experimental processes and results that transform the artist's conception of their practice and environment. The turning point in the artistic production of Buren and Warhol offers us a new understanding of the studio role and meaning of its nature and identity. And the conventional model was not dismissed or substituted by a completely new one. Instead, the existing possibilities were revised and redefined. Warhol Studio could be considered in this sense a precursor of the post studio instead of a counteracting casualty. In short, this presentation is marked by the belief that the studio cannot be easily discarded, and this commitment forces us to visit the studio again and again in an exercise of reflection and architectural criticism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Guillermo, for sticking to the time. The next presentation consists of a co-authored paper, which, as I understood, will be presented by only one of the authors. I will, however, introduce both of them. Angelica Ponzio is a professor of architecture at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, Porto Alegre, Brazil, where she also received her architectural degree. She holds a Master of GSAP and a PhD from ProPar Research at the University of Rio Grande do Sul, which was partly developed at the Politecnico di Milano. Her research fields include the study of theory and history of modern and contemporary interiors and digital design thinking, creative methodologies, and she's an expert in Gioponti's work. Andrea Machado is a professor of architecture at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, where she also received her architectural degree. She holds a Master of Architecture at the ProPar the research and graduate program in architecture, and the PhD from the PPG HIST at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. She's also a permanent member and researcher at the PROPAR in the area of architecture and urban design, with the research line on architectural typologies and morphology, and urban morphology, sorry. Her current research projects include design teaching methods based on Le Corbusier's housing principles and typologies, linked to undergraduate and graduate courses. Please share your screen with us to present a filter to frame from the fenêtre en longueur to the finestra redata.
Thank you for the presentation. Our paper title is A Filter to the Frame from the Fenêtre en longueur to the finestra redata, and we are going to present today a confrontation between Le Corbusier's and Gio-Ponti's understandings of the window as a filter device. The Le Corbusier case first. At the dawn of modernism in 1923, Le Corbusier first launched the motto, "A house is a machine for living in," and in 1930, it was time for his 5 points for a new architecture, including the horizontal window, a large horizontal ribbon void in the plane of the free facade. As Beatriz Colombina stated, the window for Le Corbusier was taken as an urban problem in which the city should be conceived as a collage of images. Therefore, as she continued her interpretation, Le Corbusier's window should function as a device made primarily to look out, to capture and frame the landscape, a gigantic screen where meant to inhabit the camera. Directly linked to the independent facades and the free plan, Le Corbusier's new concept for the horizontal window, together with the other 2 points, the roof guarding and the pilotis, functioned as a result of a new construction system enunciated within the diagram of the nominal houses of 1914. Constructively, the independent structure gave the facade an equally independent status, although coordinated within the whole of the architectural artifact. As for the windows, the system enhanced the possibility of enlargement up to the point of turning the facade into a full transparent wall, the pan de verre. The theme of the windows and its layers would occupy an important place in Le Corbusier's complete œuvre, from the horizontal fenêtre en longueur, the 1920s villages, to the post-war layers of the Brie Soleil. Between two extremes lay the glass wall, employed in his collective housings of the 1930s. As Frampton argued, the modular glass steel pan de verre facade employed in each case was intended to demonstrate the machine age aesthetic, representing a break with the 1920s villas. But a solution seldom disclosed in Le Corbusier's writing was his interpretation of the pan de verre as the quatrième mur, the fourth wall, where the camera metaphor is reassured through the concept of an applied screen diaphragm. This idea was depicted first in a sketch on the Inspiration Exacte chapter of La Ville Rêveuse of 1935, and briefly explained in an essay of the same year entitled Glass, the Fundamental Material of Modern Architecture. According to Rodrigues Casas, in 1959, Julius Salazar published a summary of the evolution of Le Corbusier's thermal and functional facades proposition, La Fenêtre en longueur, the pan de verre, the quatrième mur, the Brie Soleil, and lastly, the separation of functions, which was also related to the diaphragm metaphor. Even though the concept of the quatrième mur stands out as a paragon with Gio-Ponti's finestra redata, its employment as a whole facade solution is not widely demonstrated in Le Corbusier's work, as with Ponti's intentions for the finestra redata, the furnished window. Nevertheless, the immeuble Clarté stands out as a good object of comparison, as Le Corbusier's first residential building employing the pan de verre as an overall solution by suggesting the diaphragm metaphor in the employment of the balconies as a response to climate and domesticity. It relates to the Gio-Ponti's Viadès apartment building, besides anticipating Le Corbusier's Brie Soleil solution to be later materialized at Unité d'Habitation. As explained by Arthur Hueg, Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret designed the immeuble Clarté in 1930, realizing two technical aspirations, that of a standard modular components construction and the employment of the pan de verre constituting a new concept of housing. The name of the building reveals its essence. Clarté in French means clarity, and therefore everything in this work is taught in terms of light. Restored between 2007 and 2011, the building occupies a whole block on a 50-meter wide by 50-meter long plot. The adopted party is a variation of the Mobile Villa of 1922, an unbuilt project genesis of the Corbusian collective housing. Lodging 45 units on 9 floors, it is organized in its majority as a duplex apartments constituted as detached houses. The block condition of the Clarté building implied the existence of 4 facades facing the streets, 2 smaller ones oriented to the east and west, and 2 larger ones facing north and south, 25 meters long and entirely glazed. The option for a glass facade attached to the independent structure of the building had the advantage of bringing transparency and lightness, but it also required control of light and heat. Therefore, supporting the double glazed facades, sliding windows, glass doors, and all elements in the reinforced glass, a modular grid structure was designed. This structure also presented another layer of balconies responsible for both prolonging the internal space as for protecting the facade from sunlight from movable awnings. The alternation of an opaque and translucid sections in the overall ensemble recalls both the Pan de Verre and the Fenêtre Noguer, so dear to the Corbusier. Moreover, by employing the combination of the Pan de Verre with a layer of balconies, Le Corbusier initiates a transformation according to Silvia Correa, a sort of transition to a new approach in relation to the Pan de Verre and its sun protection. In such a way, the glass facade ceases to be just a surface, turning into a functional and technological three-dimensional layer, connecting the external surface and content. Another important breakthrough of the Immeuble Clarité Pan de Verre is that it changed the traditional typological notion of characterizing buildings according to the program. But besides being a technical element, as Flora Samuel explained, in Le Corbusier's work, the window is directly connected to the idea of framing a view. As I pointed earlier, Beatrice Colomina also suggests that notion in Le Corbusier's work by interpreting the window as a camera lens, able to enact a series of overlapping frames, directing the glaze outward and away. In the Clarité's case, the use of the Pan de Verre as a transparent wrapper also works inwards. If at first this condition might compromise even more the traditional notion of domesticity by exposing its content, to establish that a close examination of the Clarité's interiors and the extent of control design is made necessary. In the private units organization, it's primarily the structure that ordinates different spaces, moving from the facade plan to the interior of the building. The Pan de Verre's vertical divisions share the same alignments and modulations of the pillar structure, therefore drawing an imaginary grid that defines different
Hello? Is it only my computer that is frozen or in everyone's?
No, it's happening here too.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, everyone.
Are you there?
Hear me?
Are you there? Because it's frozen. And also the slide is not moving.
Slide.
Sorry, I couldn't hear. Oh, I think we lost her.
Hello, can you hear me?
Now, yes.
Well, did you hear anything that I said at all?
We heard everything you said, but your slide was frozen and I texted you, but I didn't hear from you.
I didn't see, sorry. No, the beginning is just one slide because we couldn't achieve to get Le Corbusier's images. So I don't know which part of you, did you hear everything that I said? I don't know which part of you, yeah?
To the moment there was instability, but we heard.
Okay.
I mean,
sorry for that.
No problem.
Okay, our reason. In the private units or in the organization, it's primarily the structure that ordinates the different spaces. Moving from the facade plan to the interior of the building, the Pan de Verre vertical divisions share the same alignments and modulation of the pillar structure, therefore drawing an imaginary grid that defines different environments, either acting as loose elements in the living room,
It's frozen.
partition walls. Important to notice also, as another control device, the color palettes. As Arthur Weigs explained, Le Corbusier's clavier de collet for Salubre first employed here, even if imposed a color palette to choose from, there was room to a certain extent to dispose of personal preferences. At the Clarité, the transparent glass panels located on the periphery of the rooms attract attention, promoting the promenade towards the balconies. And although the standard grid modulation and design constraints may give the impression of an uniformly illuminated and cold atmosphere of the inner environments, that whatsoever is not enough to suppress the search for a variety of the constructing backgrounds of the occupied interiors. Moreover, the combination of the two types of glass added to the dynamic organization of image spaces ended up dismantling the pure figurative perception of the sequenced layers of interiors, the balconies in the street, granting complexity to the transparency, which, as transposing Colin Rowe's interpretation of the architectural employment of glass, it stops being literal and becomes phenomenal. And that is most observed, especially at night, when the Corbusier polychromic symphony is lit and the humor filter controlled by the dwellers is revealed, demonstrated through the plan de verre, the many possibilities of framing a domestic landscape. Now, another slide. You see the slides? Yes? No?
No, we don't see any slide.
Okay. I have to share again the screen. Sorry. Now, yes? Yes? You see the slide? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. And hear me, right? Okay. The final part. Sorry. The Geoponte case. Having never fully committed to pre-established lines of thought, Geoponte was not interested in developing theories, as he defended a more pragmatic and less schematic perspective of. Nevertheless, a strong relationship between furniture and architecture is revealed in Ponte's works, and especially in the domestic realm. Thus, to correctly understand Ponte's ideas for the modern dwelling, it is necessary to realize a brief introduction on his previous developments. Ponte admired Le Corbusier, but although having published many times Le Corbusier's works and thoughts at Domus magazine, he believed that Le Corbusier's famous aphorism was long being misinterpreted. As for him, the house was not literally a machine, as a machine was not literally a house. Therefore, since the first editorial of Domus in 1928, entitled La Casa L'Italiana, Ponte promoted this interpretation for the ideas of modern living. Although based on functionalist principles, for Ponte, the Italian domestic culture was an indispensable reference. He proposed the house, although respecting sectorization, functionality, and habitability, he also proposed an inhabited space, a house with a common Latin sense. In December 1934, in an article entitled "The Ideas That I Followed in Some Constructions," Ponte published simple steps for correct designing a residential building. His intention was to contribute with solutions that not only simply oriented the design of horizontal windows rather than vertical, but instead he advised on the conception of an organism which will fully represent a way of living. In his words. In the article, a series of elements to adopt were displayed, depicting typical homes, the Domus apartment series in Milan, a group of buildings not only designed with rationalist lines, but also containing traditional elements of the Latin house. So, as you see in the slide, Ponte started developing the presence of a finestra vetrina, the display window, on balcony windows, embracing a decorative role. Here, another solution was the use of partition walls to divide rooms, the divisione diafragma, like this one, the diaphragm wall containing a finestra vetrina inside of it. You can see through the room. In the 1920s, La Casa L'Italiana would move forward into La Casa Trezzata, the equipment house, through the development of Ponte's morphological family of furniture initiated in the 30s. Finally, in 1954, Ponte presented the finestra redata, like we mentioned on the bottom. The furnished window, an evolution of the display windows and the diaphragm walls of the 1930s. This was Ponte's response for the void left on the modernist glass wall. His interpretation consisted of adding filters, or in Ponte's words, a human diaphragm, to the void left by the window. The layers were composed of shelves, paintings, and fixtures, turning the glazed surface into a piece of equipment, a transparent furnished wall, where architecture, interior, and furnished overlap. By ultimately displaying possible shades and opacities, the inner and outer scenery change depending on the natural day or artificial lights. Now the object of study comparison, the Via Desa building at Milan. The Via Desa apartment building in Milan was designed within the studio Ponte Fornaroli Rosselli and was finished in 1957. Designed with an independent concrete structure, it presented as a main feature the front layered facade, designed as a superposition of balconies with hollow and closed metal seals combined, corresponding to the respective apartments. The next layer, containing the finestra redata, was imagined first to be present in all apartments and envisioned the possibility for the dwellers to decide its shutters and balconies and colors, as much as Le Corbusier polychromies, although with more flexibility. But Ponte's design also sought the night vision, as he planned for all balconies to have an outlining night light, which added to the inner apartment's interior size through the depicted voids and silhouettes would reveal an spontaneous aspect, according to Ponte, depending on the chosen compositions. It was nevertheless on the last floor, Ponte's family apartment, that he could only present the finestra redata and achieve a great variety of spaces, colors, and shapes. And his Ponte's complexity of a human diaphragm would come to life. At Gio Ponte's apartment at the upper floor, it was a protagonist on its own, his penthouse, resembling a demonstrative apartment. Designed in its minimal details, it contained all the Ponti's inventions for the modern living. In his solar home, as he referred to it, flexibility and openness were the models. Therefore, the 160 square meter apartment was centered on a different family style, a unified space with the possibility of maximum openness and vision, represented in the plan by the Ponti and Brown arrows that we draw here. Having this in mind, the arrangement was organized to allow the bedrooms and living room to receive the maximum light and views, thus all facing the street. Ponti's promenade. In order not to over-compartmentalize the space, the Pontian promenade, which we call so, was created along the facade, thus conforming another layer. That was made possible by the combination of the furnished window with perpendicular modern fold, modern fold curtains instead of doors between the rooms. Ponti's utmost liberation of the space happened when the curtains were open, allowing the view throughout the whole apartment, albeit a certain loss of privacy. The unity was also secured by ceramic floor and ceiling patterns in bright yellow and white stripes. To conclude, Le Corbusier's immeuble Clarté, inserted in the historical urban context of Geneva, tests the Corbusian thesis under specific conditions, creating a type of building manifested in a new way of living within a prefabrication prototype with novelty and boldness for its time, either in technical constructive terms and the traditional characterization of a residential building. The Pan de Verre, the conquest of modern times, stands out in Le Corbusier's work for its complexity in characterizing the interiors, bringing together the subdivision of its modulated parts with the different functional specificities coordinated with a human scale. There, although he uses the architectural elements to define the environments, his employment of color and transparency reveals the dynamic organization of the inner space, bringing together what would be otherwise be a neutral surface. However, the biggest highlight is from the functional point of view. The balconies constitute an external layer acting as a filter or diaphragm for sun protection, the first step to the research and the use of big soleils. In his 1957 book, Armate l'Architettura, Gio Ponti dedicates a section for the window. For him, it is synonymous with life, as for him, with the windows begins the mysterious game of architecture. He refers to facade as architecture reduced to graphic art, and he ends up by saying, what about the furnished windows? They are my passion. By examining and comparing both works, many similarities can be avoided, and especially in the use of the independent facade acting as a diaphragm to the life happening inside. But if Le Corbusier's filter can be interpreted as a technical and functional one, defined by his vision of the house as a machine, Gio Ponti brings a little fantasy to the formula, adding his vision for the Casa l'Italiana. As for Ponti, and I quote, certain houses have to be strict and closed organisms on the outside, fun and surprising on the inside. Like a sonnet, they are fantasy within a role. Thank you. I'd like to just to add to thank the support of Gio Ponti Archives in Milan that is always kindly contributing to my researches. Thank you. Sorry for the mishaps.
Thank you, Angelica and Andrea, for your paper and presentation. Our final speaker is Barbara Salazar Oyarce. Barbara is an architect who holds a master's in architecture from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Her master's thesis, titled Fictional Domesticities, was selected to participate in the 21st Biennial of Architecture and Urbanism of Chile. Currently, she works as an assistant in the project City and Gender from the Universidad Católica de Chile, and as a co-researcher in the Self-Built Cities in Chile and in the Third World research project granted by the culture funds of the Chilean government. Barbara, you may share your screen with us to present Between a House and a Museum, Redefining an Emerging Typology of Exhibition.
Okay, thanks, Vanessa, for the introduction. Well, as Vanessa mentioned, I'm an architect with a Master of Architecture from Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. And in this instance, I will present part of the research developed during my master thesis entitled Fictional Domesticities. This research is originally divided into 5 parts, which is defining the premises, analyzing 3 case studies, and finally developing a design to conclude the project thesis. But today I will focus on the idea of house museums as a paradox caused by the tension between its nature as a house and a museum, where they are neither houses nor museums, they're both at the same time. In this way, the objective of the research is to exemplify and decode the tools implemented in house museums, which make these fictional domesticities an object of desire, and also to clarify the contingency of the architectural discipline in the development of these emerging platforms of exhibition. I think there's like a problem with my sharing. Oh, sorry, it's at the end. So firstly, the problems and premises of the research are defined, and for this, the context of the master studio, which was called quite the opposite, it's fundamental because it was meant to study what to do with the 4 houses left by the poet Nicanor Parra after his death in January of 2018. The logical answer would be to transform them into house museums, as it has been done with the houses of different artists and writers from Chile. From that point of view, it is worth questioning about house museums, because in their attempt to exhibit reality, they construct a fictional domesticity, enhanced by the artistic production of the author. In this way, house museums are fantasy spaces that represent desires based on domestic elements, and it also positions a narrative that fossilizes this domesticity, stipulating these places cannot be modified or altered without falsifying history. Though, what is a house museum? Is it a house that has been museified, or is it a museum disguised as a house? Considering these questions, this research identifies and analyzes the constitutive elements of this apparent typology of exhibition, redefining this concept to understand it as an ambivalent space. Moreover, in the case of the poet like Nicanor Parra, these are the houses, who used everyday objects from his domesticity, such as typewriters, chairs, and books to elaborate his visual work, imposing a static narrative of his domesticity doesn't respond to the author's artistic imaginary, since his houses were crammed with dead objects with stored energy, as he told, using his domesticity to treasure the material of possible works. For example, the image you see right now corresponds to one of the first practical works from Nicanor Parra titled La Mamadera Mortífera, which translates as the deadly bottle. As Nicanor tells, this work comes from a forgotten bottle left in his house, and instead of throwing it away, Parra added a sign in front of it, playing with words and images and changing the significance of this everyday element. In this way, which elements constitute the domestic narrative of these possible house museums? And what does a house museum represent? Should it necessarily respond to the binomial of a house transformed into a museum, or a museum disguised as a house? Especially in this case where mainly every object could be considered a work of art, how do you proceed with a transformation of a house into a house museum? The precedent of the cultural apparatus represented by the House Museum is the traditional museum, which started developing after the Enlightenment epoch. These institutions use monumental space to exhibit the ideals of a given society. In this way, the museum propagates epistemological representations that depend on those who construct them. However, after the crisis of values in the 18th century, and 19th centuries, this type of canonical experience started being questioned, giving place to other typologies, including the house museum. Thus, monumental space was turned into the museification of domestic space, changes scale, architecture, placement, and objects in this apparatus of exhibition, as you can see in the comparison between Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes and Museo Vicente Huidobro in Chile. Since its first appearance in the 19th century, this so-called typology has grown exponentially. And as a random fact, there are estimated more than 15,000 house museums in the United States alone, which is more than the number of McDonald's restaurants in the country. So it's like a really massive type of exhibition. UNESCO defines house museums as a unique, quoting, it's a unique and incomparable type of museum because they're used to preserve, exhibit, and reconstruct real atmospheres that are difficult to manipulate. Although they pretend to expose reality as it is, they go through a curatorial process that follows the same logics as a traditional museum. The domestic, therefore, is used as a fantasy space that defines the museum's fiction, using fiction as a tool to project desire into its visitors. In this way, we can stipulate that the architectural space of the house museum safeguards a lost object, which would be domesticity, turning the house museum into a fantasy space constructed from the fiction of the domestic. However, house museums are not all the same. Linda Young, a doctor in philosophy who has extensively researched this topic, suggests 5 categories of house museums, which is cultural heroes, collectors, house museums as works of art, as a historical process, and British country houses due to the extensive amount of house museums in the country. Within this framework, certain houses belonging to cultural heroes have special relevance, which is literally house museums, corresponding to 60% of the universe of house museums in the United States and England. This interested, following Linda Young's investigation, lies in the visitor's desire to bond with the author, because the literary house museums uses the domestic space to enhance the projection and the identification of the individual with the author, whilst the visitor observes representation of society as person of knowledge. And I think most of us have gone to like a house museum of someone we admire, right? In this way, the hypothesis of this research is that house museums configure desires in their visitors following the suggested strategies. First, the author's domesticity is used to convey a manipulated construction of reality. Secondly, these domestic elements facilitate the impression of a connection between visitor and author. And finally, the visitor receives these incentives, absorbing these pre-established thoughts as personal experience. In this way, the house museum is an apparatus to present desires, which are fictionally incarnated through the author's domesticity. So, which elements delimit this narrative construction? Considering house museums are based on fictional domesticities, we analyze how the exaltation of these elements of the domestic place, architecture, and objects configure different fictions and therefore project different desires. Considering the context of this investigation, it is relevant to analyze Chile's situation regarding this category of exhibition, as the number of house museums have increased exponentially during the past years. And even when I did this investigation in the past 2 years, that's been more than 15 new house museums. So it's like a really an explosion of this type of museums, not only in the world, but also like in Chile. So the examples chosen for this research correspond to 2 existing house museums, which are Casa Museo Francisco Coloane and Casa Museo Isla Negra from Pablo Neruda, as well as the possibility of a house museum in Parras houses. These respond to different ways of constructing a domestic fiction, which are dependent on the literary production of the author and the architectural space of the house museum. The first case is Casa Museo Francisco Coloane in Chiloé. This work, the work of this author is loaded with references to southern Chile as an orientation that was enhanced by his own biographical experience. Thus, the figure of Francisco Coloane seems to reinforce the qualities of the extreme south of Chile, ideas that has been accentuated by Chiloé's community itself, since he positioned the so-called the land of the southern landscapes within the international radars. Considering the above, Teolín de Higueras, the directors of Kempchi's library, decided to perpetuate the legacy of the author. In the image, you can see on the right, the house museum, and on the left, it's the library. So the organizer placed it right next to the place she worked. Consolidating this house museum was important for Kempchi because it's a really lost town in the south of Chile, and having this figure of Coloane was a way to kind of put him back in the international radar. So because of this, in 2000, the idea of rebuilding the greatest house started taking shape, turning his house into a cultural center open to community. Nevertheless, the house, the proper house of Coloane didn't exist, as it was destroyed many years back due to the earthquake from 1960. Because of that, the architect Javier Paredes reconstructed a replica of the house based on bibliographical and testimonial material from Coloane itself. But unfortunately, the funds were never raised and the plans to build the project were stopped. Despite of this, as Higueras explains, the director of the library, it was crucial to retake the initiative of House Museum to celebrate the greatest centenary in 2010. That's why her sister, Janet Higueras, donated a traditional steel house, and the neighbors donated typical objects of the area to proceed with the idea of the house museum. This construction was moved by means of a tiradora de minga, which you can see in the image, which is an act that, according to the museum director, Rosario Gateaga, is the act that consolidated the museum for the community. The distribution of the house responds to the original residential typology, arranging the program around the combustion stove. The museum doesn't have a museographic work, as the objects were donated and positioned by the community itself. If this house museum is compared with Javier Paredes' reconstruction project or with Coloane's narratives, there are many disparities found. However, these differences indicate this domestic fiction is based on the imaginary of the steel house as Chiloé's cultural synthesis, and it can be inferred that the morphology, spatial distribution, materials, and objects of Casa Museo Francisco Coloane respond to the representative characteristic of southern Chile's architecture. Consequently, this house museum constitutes a fiction based on imaginary domesticity that invents the house relationship with the author, and in turn consolidates desire for a collective imaginary. Therefore, this cultural apparatus becomes an object of desire for the community, reverting Kempchi's isolation and turning it into a focal point of touristic attraction.
Barbara, sorry to interrupt you, but you still have 20 slides, and you may want to move a little faster or try to wrap up because we're running out of time.
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna wrap up. I have a lot of images. That's the thing. It's not that long. So the second case is Casa Museo Isla Negra. Well, Neruda is a well-known politic and also poet, and he bought this really small house in Isla Negra. And the interesting thing about this case is that even though he hired an architect to start remodeling the house, he started taking place into reconstructing the house itself. So these are some of the drawings he made, and he even started like saying in the media that one of his dreams was to become an architect, that one of his frustrations was to become an architect. So talking to the media and also writing a book called Una Casa en la Arena, which is a house in the sun, he started creating this idea, an allegory that his house and thus his thoughts and poetic ideas were starting to assemble and becoming one with his life and his houses. And because he was also like a really important political figure, this house became a really important focal point during the military government from Pinochet. And after Neruda's death in 1973, obviously, because he was a communist politician, the house was destroyed and books and objects and documents were destroyed or disappeared. So when democracy came back in 1989, a foundation was created to preserve the legacy of Neruda and to preserve his objects and houses. And they started recreating with like missing objects, the house, and started creating a route to move through it, which you can see in this image. So they recreated chronologically from one point to another how his life was represented into his house. And this house became for the people an allegory of his work and became a representation of his poetry and his life. So this house operates in contradiction to Coloane's house museum, because instead of faking the relation between the house and the author, Casa Museo Isla Negra mirrors the house through the poet's narrative to validate its authenticity. In this case, the house is understood as space previously conceptualized as a museum by the author himself. Thus, this house museum represents Pablo Neruda's symbolic domesticity and presents another approach to this typology of exhibition. The two previous cases show two different situations regarding house museums. While in Casa Museo Francisco Coloane, a domestic space is museified, in Casa Museo Isla Negra, a presumable artistic space is domesticated. In this way, the third case, corresponding to a possible house museum of Nicanor Parra, latently presents the tension between a house and a museum, because while Las Cruces would imply the canonization of a domestic space, La Reina would imply the domestication of a supposed exhibition space. His practical works, as I mentioned before, is fundamental to construct the narrative of a house museum, because this work highlights everyday objects through the connotation of language and tries to revive these objects. It became one of Parra's fundamental strategy. So this idea of resuscitating and bringing like dead things into life is one of the main principles for his work of art, and also what he started doing with his houses. Here you can see his house in La Reina, which was the first house he acquired, and he started building up and adding pieces to the side, and also adding furniture and objects through it. And he even he started adding furniture from different epochs because he wanted to create this narrative into the house. And besides taking part in the architecture part and taking part in the object part, he also resignified the house by calling it the Open University of La Reina. So he publicly transformed his house into a platform of showing his work and getting people to know his way of working and thinking. And on the other side, we have the house in Las Cruces, where he moved when he was older, and it was a way of escaping this kind of platform he had created, and he got precluded and secluded in this house, and he got away from the media, and he got away from the artistic works. So while in La Reina, we have this idea of kind of like a backstage of his work. In Las Cruces, it's just a house where he lived, and he just had like a normal life in it. So we can see these two possibilities of which house museum do we create? Do we create this house museum of this already mediatized house, or do we create this house museum where he actually lived in the past years? So in this way, this case and this idea of the binary structures of house museums is blurred because it's not black and white. It's like a duality of how this way of exhibiting behaves as both a house and both as a museum, because it's never in one place or another. It's always a mixture between that. So this binary structure of the...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
we have to stop at this point.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, I just have like 1 minute. I'm closing now. Yeah. So the binary structure of house museums limits the possibilities of the architectural project, because simplifying this complexity in this dichotomy scheme only implies a question of proportion, which cancels the possibility of conceiving those architectures as actually a typology. And even though the investigation revolves around this confrontation, this is used to pose a deeper understanding of the house museum's possibility. For example, can a cemetery maybe be considered a house museum? What would we consider a house museum if we expand the notion of it? So by recognizing the elements that create those immersive fictions, architecture can transgress the standard conditions of this category of exhibition. Hence, we can constantly redefine the boundaries of what is understood as house museums, suggesting a disruptive typology that expands the traditional possibilities to exhibit cultural values rather than sticking to a standardized possibility of typology of exhibition.
I thank the speakers for the interventions, and we move to the discussion about the binaries or comparisons addressed in the 4 papers or presentations, which I very much enjoyed reading and following. I do have specific questions for each of you, which I'll keep for later or another time because we don't have much time. But before opening the floor or the screen to questions, I would like to steer the conversation towards the cultural value of architecture, because there are many, many interesting aspects correlating the papers, interestingly enough. And the main one which surfaced for me is the issue of culture. So architecture and the culture of competition as a privileged platform for cross-cultural friction, architecture and digital culture, architecture, studio culture, and the rise of conceptual and performance art, architecture and domestic culture, architecture and museum culture in view of writing and curatorial practices. So I open the discussion by stressing how the comparisons in the 4 papers seem to point to the complexity of how we define culture and its imprint on architectural ideas and vice versa in our increasingly global urban society. From the golden age of modernism, its questioning in the late 60s and 70s to the age of the thingless medium, when aura is produced without objects, to take a cue from media theorist Boris Groys. So these binaries seem to tackle the role of the cultural in architectural technology, materiality, typology, program, and space, looking at meaning and communication, formation of collective memory, national identities, and cross-national possibilities. So would you possibly further elaborate on that? And I invite the audience to already either raise their virtual hands or write their questions down on the chat or state if they prefer just to speak out.
I can start on our presentation, especially on the part of my piece on Gio Ponti. Culture is like an essence of his work, and that's why he tries to bring it not only to specifically to use it in Italy, but abroad. Like his most famous house is Villa Planchatis in Venezuela. So he started bringing this Mediterranean concept of architecture and spreading in many parts. Now they're going to start launch a new book in Gio Ponti on the Middle East. So he had this point of his career where he was very international architect, besides the work of Domus, where he uses as an instrument to spread the Italian culture, the Italian way of life. Either he did this on ships, transatlantic ships after the war. He participated in competitions, and he wanted the ships to be like a museum, so to speak, because he would invite artists to put their works on the spaces that he was designing, as like a showcase of Italy all over. And then we can correlate, especially here in Brazil, to many of these aspects, especially with this Mediterranean, the similar aspects of that, and that we can identify even in the works of Lúcio Costa or our Brazilian architects. So his the value for Le Corbusier for him is very important. He maintained a correspondence with Le Corbusier. Sometimes he visits l'unité d'habitation, and I have access to the so we can trace many influences and all over his work, but he's always doesn't copy and paste. He does his interpretation, and that's why he finished the article adding the word of fantasy, which is the word that he always uses. It's like a little color, a little fantasy, a little, and that's why also because he was for a long time excluded from modern historiography, because his works are between functionalism and modernism and historicism or interpretation or even the traditional aspects or vernacular aspects of architecture. It's like a sort of a humane architecture with a place for the user, but on his lens. So that's my contribution.
Thanks, Angelica. Any other comments about the use of culture?
I could come in. So I'm framing this Japanese competition as a cross-cultural encounter between architectural ideas from different architecture cultures. In my case, I talk about Japanese architecture culture. Maybe it's because it's framed very much or catalog, let's say, this competition according to nations where the people come from, where they submit. But the most important thing is that I see this competition really as the coming together of different ideas with different backgrounds. So I don't want to see this competition strictly as an idea from Japan or an idea from any other nation. And also in this kind of culture of the competition, I think it's very much important that although it's the master architect here acting as the judge, I think it's very important to include all the different responses from the contestants on an equal level, because of the competition logic that the judge set the theme, we have all the responses coming in, and then the judge make a final comments, which are published as well. So it's a whole, I see the competition as a dialogue.
Sure. I have a question for Barbara, but I'm not sure if she's still there. Yeah, so I wanted to ask you in terms of your paper, more than even your presentation, because at some point in the end of the paper, you talk about mass culture very abruptly. And I was curious about how mass culture enters, in your analysis of this typology and its evolution in the specific cases of the writers in Chile?
Well, in the case of Chile, it's really interesting because even these houses are placed in a specific touristic field called the Coast of the Poets. So even as a name, these houses enter like into system of mass consumption. That's what I meant when I started talking about mass culture, and how this idea of having these figures, having these authors, is not only about knowing his work, but it's also how can people get into that sphere and consume not also the art, but also the place that is around it. Like these little towns where the house museums are placed are really interesting touristic points, because it's the house and it's like a kilometer around it. It's really, really crowded, and it's really full of people and full of restaurants and places to go, and this whole mechanism works around it. But if you go 1 block away from it, it's empty and it's like nobody knows about it. So house museums are really interesting as a focal point of starting an engine in places around this author.
So you would say that architecture will operate in a kind of mediation between high and low culture. Could you advance this argument?
Not really. I'm not quite sure of like saying yes to that question, like strictly. But in these cases, I would say it is, especially in the case of Neruda. It's well, this paper, as I mentioned in the beginning, finishes in project, an architectural project. And it's funny because Neruda is this really canonic poet, and he lived in the fancy neighborhood in Isla Negra, and he always talks about this high way of like living life, even though he was a communist. And 1 kilometer away from it, you can find Parra's house, which is actually abandoned, and where Parras only work with this low culture idea of poetry. So actually my project was to communicate these two places through this kind of cemetery, a cemetery museum house. So I mean, it depends on the author. I'm not saying architecture is a way to communicate the high and low. In this case, it depends on the figure itself, but it can be a possibility to do that.
Yes, thank you so much. So Leandro has a question to Katelaine. The issue of architecture competition found my attention. I remember that in the 90s, competitions were events to discuss architecture city theory. Perhaps they forced a duality between the real market and the disciplinary field. It seems to me that this has disappeared. Am I wrong or a little outdated?
So the question is not in the chat now, in my chat, but so I try to follow it. So I think what's important to mention that it is an idea competition. So there is no intention that the build will come out, and it's also a very long running competition, quite unique. And then that we have this idea of the single judge is completely different if you have a team of judges. So all of this makes a combination that they can set really, let's say, exceptional themes to put on the table. And I think, so to clarify, this competition is actually still running. So it says something about the importance of this kind of platforms. But so a lot of the research is also based on oral interviews with former winners and judges. And there is let's say, a development over time. So now, of course, let's say from, if I'm not wrong, 2000, well, at a certain point, the entries could be digital, send in. So also the kind of submission changed. Suddenly, it's very easy to participate. So, so I want to make clear that let's say, the platform of an idea competition and the importance of it changed somehow. So of course, people who still participate think it should continue, because it's this space, free space of ideas, of, let's say, fictional ideas, of dreaming, but so important for the architectural profession. So I believe in the strength of it, let's say, but I also have some critique about, let's say, the latest editions, how they frame it. It's become more commercialized, let's say. They started to work with a team of judges suddenly, while the strength of this competition is a single judge. Did I answer somehow your question? Yeah, okay.
Good.
Thanks, Leandro.
Do we have time for a final question for Guillermo? I would like to ask you, in following up on what Catalina just said about the digital, how to think of the studio in the age of the digital? Where is your study taking you in terms of today's modus operandi, let's say, of artists, conceptual art, performance?
Yeah, like probably my research is kind of my starting point, but of course I want to actually get to the contemporary art studios. So the digital, of course, it's already here. So and probably we can find a lot of examples of artists working through digital media with their own computers. And recently there was a digital collage that it was sold for, I don't know how many millions of dollars. So of course the digital age is getting through the studio also. And I think it's probably a path I need to explore, because the digital also involves like a series of components that there were not incorporated, of course, in the work of Warhol and Buren. But yeah, I think that of course this digital age can also affect architectural design of the studios. So I think that probably I should get on and advance in my research in that point also.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid we have to close the session because everybody in Brazil has to have lunch. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And yeah, I look forward to the next sessions.